Imagine buying your dream home only to have the HOA slap you with hundreds of dollars in fines, all because your grass wasn't perfect. That's exactly what happened to one homeowner. But instead of giving in, he fought back and turned his yard into something the HOA could never control. A full-blown jungle. And trust me, they never saw this coming asterisk. The story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where every house looks almost identical. Perfectly trimmed hedges, driveways washed clean, mailboxes painted the exact same shade of beige. From the outside, it looked like a peaceful community, but anyone who has ever lived under the thumb of a homeowners association knows that appearances can be deceiving. For the main homeowner in this story, let's call him Mark, the neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of saving, he had finally purchased a house with a decent yard. He wasn't obsessed with keeping things picture perfect, but he cared enough to mow his lawn every couple of weeks and keep the weeds from taking over. He thought he was doing fine. But the HOA thought differently. It started with a letter in the mailbox, a crisp white envelope with the HOA's official seal on the front. Inside, the words were sharp, cold, and accusing. They claimed his lawn was in violation of community standards. The grass, they said, was unsightly and not in compliance with neighborhood expectations. He was being fined $200. Mark stared at the letter in disbelief. His lawn wasn't perfect, sure, but it looked no worse than any other house on the block. It was green, it was alive, and it wasn't overgrown. Yet the HOA decided that a few uneven patches of grass were enough to slap him with a hefty penalty. At first, he brushed it off. He figured maybe it was a mistake or an overzealous HOA board member trying to flex their authority. He paid the fine reluctantly, thinking it would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A month later, another letter arrived. This time, the fine was even larger, $300. The letter accused him of failing to maintain acceptable landscaping standards. It even went so far as to say that his home was bringing down neighborhood property values. That phrase burned. Mark had worked too hard for his house. To be told that he was somehow lowering the entire community's worth. He began to notice something else, too. His neighbors were watching him. Every time he stepped outside, it felt like eyes followed him. Curtains twitched. Cars slowed down in front of his house, and at HOA meetings, whispers seemed to circle around him. It wasn't just about the lawn anymore. It felt personal. Mark tried to fight back. He appealed the fines, sending in photos of his yard, showing that the grass was cut and the landscaping was neat. But every appeal was denied. The HOA claimed they had documented evidence of non-compliance, though they never showed him a single photo. By the third letter, the tone had changed. The HOA threatened legal action if he didn't pay. They said they had the power to place a lien on his property. They were essentially saying that if he didn't bend to their rules, they could take his home. It was around that time that Mark started digging deeper into the HOA. He discovered that the board was run by just 3 people, neighbors, who had lived in the community for decades. They prided themselves on keeping standards high. But what Mark saw was nothing more than control. They nitpicked, they targeted, and they ruled through intimidation. The more he learned, the angrier he became. He realized that no matter what he did, they would keep coming after him. If his grass was too long, they'd fine him. If he cut it too short, they'd fine him again. There was no winning. And that's when he had an idea. A wild, outrageous idea. Instead of trying to play by the HOA's rules, what if he did the exact opposite? What if he gave them something so far beyond their control that they couldn't touch him? Something that would turn their obsession with uniform lawns into a complete nightmare. Mark began researching. He looked into local laws, environmental codes, and city ordinances. That's when he stumbled across something called a Certified Wildlife Habitat Program. Homeowners could legally transform their yards into protected habitats for pollinators, birds, and native plants. Once certified, the HOA couldn't force them to mow it down, couldn't fine them, and couldn't override it, because the designation came from state and national organizations. The more he read, the more excited he became. This wasn't just revenge. This was a loophole, a way to flip the script and make the HOA powerless. And so, instead of pulling out his mower the next weekend, Mark started planning. He ordered native wildflower seeds by the pound. He researched shrubs that grew tall and thick. He looked into ponds, birdhouses, and composting systems. His yard wasn't just going to be a lawn anymore. It was going to be a jungle. Of course, he knew this would take time. And he knew the HOA wouldn't sit quietly while his plan unfolded. But for the first time since the fines started, he felt in control again. The thought of their shocked faces, when they realized what he had done, was enough to keep him going. The first step was tearing up the traditional grass. He rented equipment and spent days ripping it out. The HOA patrol car drove by twice during that week, slowing down each time. He could feel the eyes on him. He could almost hear the whispers spreading through the neighborhood. By the end of the week, his front yard was nothing but dirt. To the HOA, it must have looked like he was giving up. But to Mark, it was the beginning of something bigger, something they would never be able to stop. As the sun set on that final day, he stood on his porch, looking out at the bare soil. It didn't look like much yet, but soon it would grow. And when it did, the HOA would have no idea what hit them. This was only the start. The next phase of Mark's plan was preparation. His lawn, once a typical stretch of suburban grass, had been reduced to a wide bed of soil. Neighbors slowed their cars to gawk. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, others whispered as they passed on evening walks. But Mark ignored them. To him, the dirt was not a sign of failure. It was a blank canvas. He started with seeds. Boxes and bags arrived on his doorstep, each one filled with carefully chosen varieties. Native wildflowers like coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and milkweed. Shrubs that would grow thick and unruly, providing shade and cover. Low-maintenance ground covers to creep across the soil like living carpets. He even ordered fruit-bearing plants, blueberries, raspberries, and dwarf apple trees. Every single one of them was allowed by city code. Though they looked nothing like the manicured lawns the HOA demanded, Mark worked tirelessly. He spent evenings after his job preparing the soil, raking it smooth, scattering seeds, and covering them with mulch. The HOA's patrol car drove by almost daily now, slowing to a crawl in front of his house. The driver, a stern-faced woman with a clipboard, jotted down notes each time. Mark almost smiled when he saw her. He knew what she was writing. Non-compliance. Yard in violation. Grass missing. What she didn't know was that he was already one step ahead. Within a few weeks, small green shoots began to appear. At first, they looked like weeds. The HOA likely saw them as proof that Mark had given up on his lawn. But slowly, those shoots grew taller, stronger, and more colorful. Bright yellows, deep purples, and fiery reds began to spread across his yard. By midsummer, the once barren dirt was alive with blossoms. Butterflies flitted from flower to flower. Bees buzzed busily. Birds began visiting, perching on the branches of the young shrubs he had planted. The neighbors' whispers grew louder. Some complained that his yard looked wild and untidy. Others were curious, intrigued by the sudden explosion of life in a community where every yard looked the same. A few even complimented him in hushed tones, telling him they secretly admired the beauty he was creating. But most kept their distance, unwilling to cross the invisible line drawn by the HOA. And then came the letters. This time. They were not simple fines. They were warnings filled with escalating threats. The HOA accused him of letting his lawn fall into disrepair. They claimed his yard was a breeding ground for pests. They even went so far as to say his property was a public safety hazard. The fines stacked higher, hundreds of dollars each, with bolded text warning that legal action was imminent. Mark didn't panic. He had been expecting this. Each time he received a letter, he calmly filed it away in a folder labeled, "Ho nonsense." He refused to pay a single cent, because by now he had already applied for certification. The application for a certified wildlife habitat wasn't complicated. He had to document the food sources he provided for wildlife, the cover for animals, the water features, and the sustainable practices he was following. He submitted photos of his flowers, his shrubs, his compost pile, and even the small bird bath he had installed in the corner of his yard. Within weeks, the certification came. Through. A green and white sign arrived in the mail, proudly declaring his yard an official habitat. He mounted it at the edge of his driveway where everyone could see it. The HOA's reaction was immediate. At the next community meeting, his yard became the central topic. Though Mark wasn't in the room, word spread quickly about the outrage. The board members called it an eyesore, claiming it destroyed the visual harmony of the neighborhood. They tried to pressure him publicly, demanding he restore compliance. But when Mark calmly pointed out his certification, the room fell quiet. By law, they couldn't override it. They had lost their leverage. Still, that didn't mean they would give up. The patrol car kept circling. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city about overgrowth. Inspectors came out only to confirm that everything was within legal limits. Each time, the HOA's frustration grew. Meanwhile, Mark's jungle thrived. By late summer, his yard had transformed into a riot of color and sound. Hummingbirds darted through the air. Butterflies covered the milkweed. Small rabbits even began to appear in the underbrush, nibbling at the edges of the plants. The air was alive with movement, a stark contrast to the silent, sterile lawns surrounding him. Neighbors couldn't ignore it anymore. Some were annoyed, grumbling about property values and mess, but others were charmed. Children loved running past his house to spot butterflies. A local gardener stopped by to ask about his plant choices. A few neighbors even asked for tips on how to start their own pollinator gardens. Mark knew then that his plan was working. The HOA wanted uniformity, control, and obedience, but his yard was breaking that mold. It was showing people another way, to live in the neighborhood. One that wasn't dictated by petty fines and power-hungry board members. Still, he also knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA wasn't the kind of organization to accept defeat quietly. He could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Each letter grew harsher, each glare from the board members sharper. And then, one day, he received something unexpected, a certified letter, hand-delivered to his door. Inside was not a fine, but a summons. The HOA was officially taking him to court. For them. This wasn't about grass anymore. It was about power. They couldn't stand that he had found a loophole, that he had made them look foolish, and now they were determined to crush him publicly. Mark stared at the summons, then back at his thriving jungle of a yard. Birds chirped in the branches, bees buzzed lazily in the flowers. His plan had worked so far, but this was the next level of the fight. The HOA was ready to drag him through the legal system to prove a point. He smiled to himself. They had no idea how ready he was. The summons from the HOA wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. Mark read it carefully, line by line. They accused him of willful non-compliance, negligent maintenance, and endangerment of community property values. The HOA was asking the court to impose daily fines, force him to restore his lawn to community standards, and pay all legal fees. In short, they wanted to crush him financially until he submitted. For most homeowners, this kind of letter would have been terrifying. Legal battles are expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. The HOA knew this, and that was why they used the courts as a weapon. But Mark was different. He had already prepared for this possibility. He had evidence, documentation, and the biggest, Advantage of all, the law on his side. The weeks leading up to the court date were intense. Mark built a binder thicker than a dictionary. Inside, he organized photographs of his yard at every stage, before the transformation, during the planting, and after it flourished. He printed copies of his certified wildlife habitat documents. He included emails from city inspectors confirming his compliance. He even collected testimonials from neighbors who admired his garden. Every accusation the HOA threw at him had a carefully prepared counter-argument. Meanwhile, the HOA grew louder. Their board members sent angry emails to the community, painting Mark as a troublemaker who was ruining the neighborhood. They warned that if he wasn't stopped, others might follow his example, and the community would spiral into chaos. For them, it was about more than grass or flowers. It was about control. If Mark won, it would set a precedent. The day of the court hearing arrived. Mark walked into the courtroom calm and steady, his binder in hand. The HOA board members sat across from him, dressed sharply, flanked by their attorney. They looked smug, certain they had already won. To them, he was just one homeowner against an entire organization. They thought the outcome was inevitable. The judge entered, and the case began. The HOA's attorney wasted no time launching into accusations. They described Mark's yard as a hazardous wasteland, claiming it attracted rodents, snakes, and even coyotes. They argued that his jungle lowered property values and scared potential buyers. They insisted that the HOA had the authority to enforce uniform standards for the good of the community. Their argument was polished, rehearsed, and dripping with exaggeration. Then it was Mark's turn. He stood, opened his binder, and calmly began presenting his case. He showed photos of the vibrant flowers, the butterflies, the birds. He displayed his certification and explained how his yard provided food and shelter for pollinators, which benefited the entire ecosystem. He pointed out that everything he planted was legal under city ordinances. He read letters from inspectors, who had confirmed there were no violations. The courtroom shifted. What had started as a one-sided assault from the HOA began to look like a battle of reason versus pettiness. The judge leaned forward, flipping through Mark's documents with interest. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Mark wasn't finished. He had saved his trump card for last. He presented a letter from a local environmental organization praising his efforts for contributing to biodiversity and encouraging sustainable practices. The letter explained that yards like his helped counter the decline of pollinators, something crucial not just for neighborhoods, but for agriculture and the broader environment. The judge sat back, expression unreadable. After a long pause, the decision was made. The HOA's claims were dismissed. They had no legal right to override the certification or force him to remove his habitat. Their demand for fines was denied. Their request for attorney fees was rejected. Mark had won. The board members' faces were red with frustration as they packed up their papers. Their attorney muttered under his breath, clearly disappointed at the loss of what he thought would be an easy case. Mark, meanwhile, walked out of the courtroom with his binder in hand and a quiet smile on his face. He hadn't just defended his yard, he had exposed the HOA's overreach in a very public way. News of the court victory spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents congratulated him quietly, emboldened by his success. Others avoided him, perhaps afraid of drawing the HOA's ire. But one thing was certain. The HOA's aura of invincibility had cracked. Everyone had seen that they could be beaten. For Mark, though, the victory was only part of the story. Winning in court meant his jungle was safe, but he wasn't content to simply let it exist. He wanted it to thrive. He wanted it to grow so large, so vibrant, so alive that it became impossible to ignore. The HOA had tried to shame him for his yard, but now he would make it the crown jewel of the community. In the weeks after the court case, he doubled down on his project. He expanded his plantings, adding even more varieties of wildflowers. He installed a small pond, complete with water lilies and a solar-powered fountain. Frogs soon made it their home, adding their voices to the nightly chorus. He built birdhouses and bat boxes, encouraging even more wildlife to move in. His once ordinary yard was evolving into a full ecosystem, buzzing and humming with life. And as it grew, so did the attention. Local gardening groups came to visit, inspired by what he had built. A journalist from a nearby paper even wrote an article about his suburban jungle, praising it as a model for sustainable living. The photos of his yard, bursting with color and life, spread online, drawing admiration from people far beyond his neighborhood. The HOA, however, was seething. They had failed to control him in court, but that didn't mean they had given up. If anything, his growing popularity made them more determined than ever to find a way to bring him down. And so, while Mark celebrated his victory and nurtured his jungle, the HOA regrouped in the shadows. They began planning their next move, one that wouldn't rely on legal arguments alone. Because if they couldn't beat him fairly, they were prepared to bend the rules. The courtroom battle had ended, but the war was far from over. While Mark celebrated his victory and tended to his growing jungle, the HOA seethed in quiet frustration. They had been humiliated in front of the judge, their authority undermined, their power questioned. For people who thrived on control, that kind of loss wasn't something they could accept. It started subtly. A few weeks after the trial, Mark began receiving anonymous complaints. At first, it was letters slipped into his mailbox without return addresses. They accused him of attracting vermin and lowering property values. The language was crude, filled with personal jabs and veiled threats. He ignored them, tossing them into the trash. Then came the visits. City inspectors showed up at his door, claiming they'd received reports of code violations. One checked his pond for mosquito infestations. Another inspected his compost pile. A third claimed to be investigating excessive noise. Each time the inspectors left empty-handed, apologizing as they admitted there was nothing wrong. But Mark knew what was happening. The HOA was weaponizing the system, bombarding him with complaints to wear him down. The harassment escalated. One morning, he woke up to find his certified wildlife habitat sign missing from his yard. Someone had pried it out of the ground and stolen it overnight. A few days later, his trash bins were knocked over, their contents scattered across his driveway. On another occasion, his garden hose had been slashed. Mark wasn't naive. He knew these weren't random acts. The timing was too perfect, the target too specific. The HOA board members never showed their hands directly, but their fingerprints were all over the chaos. But instead of reacting with anger, Mark responded with strategy. He installed security cameras around his property, high resolution, motion activated, and connected to cloud storage. Every corner of his yard was now under watch. He posted small warning signs at the edges of his property, letting everyone know the cameras were rolling. If the HOA wanted to keep playing dirty, he was ready to catch them in the act. And sure enough, the cameras soon paid off. Late one night, the footage captured a figure creeping onto his property, attempting to pull up a row of newly planted shrubs. The person wore dark clothing and a hood, but the face was unmistakable. One of the HOA board members. The same woman who had written the first fine against him months ago. Mark didn't rush to confront her. Instead, he archived the footage, labeling it carefully. He knew it would come in handy later. Meanwhile, his jungle continued to thrive. By midsummer, the yard had grown into a lush paradise. The pond was home to frogs and dragonflies. The flowers burst with color, attracting a steady stream of butterflies and bees. Birds nested in the shrubs, filling the mornings with song. What had once been just a lawn was now a living ecosystem, richer and more vibrant than anything else. In the neighborhood, neighbors couldn't ignore it anymore. Children came by to watch the fish in the pond. Gardeners stopped to take notes. Even passers-by from outside the community slowed down to admire the spectacle. What the HOA had tried to label an eyesore had become a point of pride for many. Residents but with admiration came division. Some neighbors sided with Mark, inspired by his defiance and the beauty of his creation. Others clung to the HOA's narrative, muttering about mess and lowered property values. The neighborhood began to split, fault lines forming between those who valued freedom and those who wanted rigid order. The HOA sensed their grip slipping, and they doubled down. They began sending out mass emails filled with exaggerated claims. They warned residents that Mark's uncontrolled jungle was inviting disease-carrying pests. They even circulated photos of snakes in the area, implying, without evidence, that they came from his yard. Fear was their weapon now, and they wielded it ruthlessly. Mark, however, was ready. He countered their campaign with facts. He created a simple website documenting his project, complete with photos, scientific explanations, and links to resources about pollinator gardens and wildlife habitats. He shared it on community forums and social media. His jungle wasn't just a rebellion against the HOA anymore, it was becoming a movement. The more the HOA attacked, the more attention he received. A local news station picked up the story, running a segment titled "Suburban Jungle or Neighborhood Nuisance." The footage showed his vibrant yard teeming with life, contrasted against the sterile uniform lawns around him. Interviews with neighbors revealed the divide, some praising his efforts while others parroted the HOA's complaints. For Mark, the publicity was a victory. The more visible his yard became, the harder it was for the HOA to quietly destroy him. Their smear campaign was backfiring. Instead of turning people against him, it was turning him into a symbol of resistance against oppressive HOAs everywhere. But the board wasn't finished. In their eyes, Mark's growing popularity was even more dangerous than his jungle. If they didn't stop him soon, they risked losing control of the entire community. And so, behind closed doors, they plotted their boldest move yet. One morning, Mark received a notice taped to his front door. It wasn't another fine. It wasn't another threat of legal action. It was something far more drastic, a notice of foreclosure proceedings. The HOA claimed that his unpaid fines had accumulated to the point where they could initiate foreclosure on his property. Mark laughed when he read it. He hadn't paid a single fine, but he also knew that most of those fines had been dismissed in court. The notice was nothing more than an intimidation tactic. But for most homeowners, that piece of paper would have been enough to cause panic. That was the HOA's strategy, fear. This time, however, they had overplayed their hand. Mark had the court documents, the legal rulings, and the video evidence of their harassment. He knew the law, and he knew he wasn't alone anymore. His jungle had given him allies, neighbors, environmental groups, and even reporters who were now following the story closely. The HOA thought they were tightening the noose. What they didn't realize was that Mark was about to turn the tables once again. The foreclosure notice taped to Mark's front door was meant to be the HOA's killing blow. It was supposed to terrify him, to make him panic, to force him into submission. For most homeowners, it would have worked. The threat of losing your home is enough to break almost anyone. But not Mark. He stood in front of his jungle, the flowers swaying in the summer breeze, and smiled. The HOA thought they held the upper hand, but they didn't realize just how much ammunition he had quietly been collecting. They were about to learn that when you push someone too far, you risk waking up the very storm you've been trying to suppress. The first step was exposure. Mark began compiling everything: the stolen sign, the slashed garden hose, the late-night footage of a board member sneaking into his yard. He organized it just like he had with his court binder, neatly, clearly, and with undeniable timestamps. He uploaded clips from the security cameras online, blurring his house number but leaving the face of the board member clear. Within hours, the video spread. Neighbors shared it. Local forums lit up with debates. The footage of a supposed community leader trespassing on his property was damning. Some residents tried to defend the board, but the evidence was irrefutable. For the first time, people began to question whether the HOA's obsession with control had gone too far. Next comma. Mark reached out to the same journalist who had covered his story earlier. This time, he had even juicier material. The news segment that followed was explosive. Homeowner claims HOA harassment caught on camera. The broadcast showed clips of his thriving habitat, contrasted with the vandalism and harassment he had endured. Interviews with sympathetic neighbors painted the HOA as bullies, out of touch and out of control. The public reaction was swift. Messages of support poured in from outside the neighborhood. People who had fought their own HOA battles reached out with encouragement. Environmental groups praised him for defending biodiversity in the face of hostility. Even legal experts weighed in online, pointing out that the foreclosure notice was unenforceable given the court's prior ruling. The HOA board, once so smug and confident, now found themselves on the defensive. Their emails to the community became frantic, filled with accusations that Mark was manipulating the media and distorting the truth. But the harder they tried to spin the story, the more desperate they looked. Residents who had once been loyal began to distance themselves. Some even resigned from committee roles, unwilling to be associated with the chaos. Meanwhile, Mark doubled down on his jungle. He expanded the pond, adding a small waterfall powered by solar panels. He planted more fruit trees, creating a miniature orchard that promised harvests for years to come. He added benches along the pathways, inviting neighbors to come and enjoy the beauty firsthand. His yard wasn't just a personal victory anymore. It was a community space, alive and welcoming. Children flocked to it after school, running through the flowers and watching butterflies land on their shoulders. Elderly neighbors stopped by to rest on the benches, enjoying the shade and the sound of water. Even people who had once grumbled about messiness found themselves drawn to the peacefulness of the space. The jungle had become a sanctuary, a place of connection in a neighborhood that had once been defined by rigid sameness. And then came the moment that sealed the HOA's fate. At the next community-wide meeting, tensions were at an all-time high. The board tried to open with their usual agenda, but residents weren't interested in landscaping rules or budget updates. They wanted answers. Why had the board targeted a homeowner who was legally in the right? Why had they wasted community funds on a failed lawsuit? Why were board members sneaking onto private property in the middle of the night? The questions came hard and fast, and the board had no satisfying answers. Mark didn't even need to speak. His jungle spoke for him. His evidence spoke for him. The board's own actions had spoken louder than anything he could say. By the end of the meeting, a motion was introduced, a vote of no confidence in the board. The room erupted in applause. The following weeks were a turning point. The board members who had orchestrated the campaign against him were forced to resign. Under pressure, new elections were scheduled, and for the first time in years, multiple residents stepped up to run. The aura of fear that had hung over the neighborhood began to lift. Mark had not only defended his home, he had sparked change. But he wasn't content to stop there. He donated part of his harvest to a local food pantry, showing that his yard was more than just decoration. He invited school groups to visit, teaching children about pollinators and ecosystems. His once ordinary house had become a hub of activity, admired far beyond the limits of the HOA's little kingdom. The very fines that were meant to shame him had become the foundation of his greatest triumph. And the jungle, once seen as defiance, was now celebrated as a symbol of resilience. The HOA had tried to bury him in rules, intimidation, and fear. Instead, they had planted the seed of their own downfall. But even in victory, Mark knew one thing: power never fades quietly. The old board members might have been forced out, but they weren't gone. And in the shadows, they were still looking for ways to reclaim control. The battle wasn't over yet. The neighborhood had changed. What was once a sterile row of cookie-cutter homes with identical lawns now had a heartbeat. Mark's jungle pulsed with life, a riot of color and sound that drew people in and reminded them that nature didn't have to be pushed out of suburban life. But not everyone celebrated. The former HOA board members, forced out by the community after their harassment was exposed, had not disappeared. They still lived in the neighborhood, watching from behind their curtains, bitter and resentful. For them, the jungle wasn't a victory for beauty or freedom. It was a daily reminder of their humiliation. Their last act of desperation came quietly, almost cowardly. Late one night, weeks after they had been voted out, Mark awoke to strange sounds outside. When he checked his cameras, his heart sank. 3 figures, hooded, moving quickly, were tearing through his yard. They stomped on flowers, yanked up saplings, and tossed rocks into the pond. Their rage was clumsy but destructive. For a moment, Mark felt the weight of exhaustion. After everything he had fought through, the fines, the court case, the smear campaigns, here they were again, trying to undo his work out of spite. But then he remembered. He had prepared for this. Every corner of his property was under surveillance. Every step they took was being recorded in crisp, undeniable detail. By morning, he had already filed a report with the police. The footage was so clear that the vandals couldn't deny it. When the authorities arrived at their doors, the truth came out. The culprits were the very same ex-board members who had targeted him from the beginning. Their attempt to destroy his jungle had only succeeded in destroying themselves. The charges weren't just embarrassing, they were public. Word spread quickly, not just through the neighborhood, but into the wider community. The same news outlets that had covered his jungle before now had a new headline: Former HOA leaders arrested for vandalism. The images of once powerful board members in handcuffs sealed the final chapter of their downfall. For Mark, the vindication was sweet. He hadn't lifted a finger to retaliate, he had simply let their own hatred expose them. The jungle had outlasted them, outgrown them, and now outsmarted them. With the old regime gone, the neighborhood began to breathe again. The newly elected HOA board, made up of residents tired of the old ways, approached Mark not with fines or threats, but with questions. How could they support pollinator-friendly gardens? Could they host community events in his yard? Would he be willing to help create guidelines that encouraged sustainability instead of stifling it? Mark agreed, not out of obligation, but out of passion. His jungle had started as defiance, but now it was a foundation for something bigger. He organized a neighborhood garden tour, showcasing not just his yard, but also those of other residents, who had begun experimenting with native plants and wildflowers. The event drew crowds, sparked conversations, and even attracted attention from local environmental groups. In the fall, the community held its first harvest festival using fruit from Mark's orchard and honey from a neighbor's new beehives. Children painted birdhouses, adults swapped gardening tips. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community rather than a dictatorship. And through it all, the jungle thrived. The flowers changed with the seasons, painting the yard in waves of color. The pond grew deeper, clearer, home to fish and frogs. Migrating birds stopped by on their way south. At night, fireflies lit up the garden, turning it into a living constellation. Neighbors, who once complained about property values, now boasted to visitors about living near the famous jungle house. What the HOA had tried to frame as an eyesore was now a badge of honor. Realtors even began to notice. Houses near Mark's sold faster, buyers intrigued by the idea of a neighborhood with character instead of uniformity. The very fear the HOA had used to justify their attacks had proven false. Property values weren't sinking, they were thriving. And Mark? He felt a quiet satisfaction each time he sat on his porch, listening to the symphony of crickets, frogs, and birds. He hadn't just saved his home. He had reshaped his neighborhood. His fight had exposed the dark side of HOA power, but it had also shown the strength of persistence, creativity, and community. The irony wasn't lost on him. The fines that had started this war had been about grass. Too long, too uneven, too imperfect. The HOA wanted sameness, obedience, silence. But in trying to enforce their rigid vision, they had unleashed something they could never control. A jungle that grew wilder, louder, and stronger with every season. And now, the jungle had won. The end. This closes the six-part story. From the first fine, to rebellion, to courtroom battle, to harassment, to exposure, to ultimate victory.